Hello everybody. Having just returned from another trip to the United States, I've been reminded of one of my favourite petrol head talking points, and that is the fact that despite many manufacturers trying to be increasingly global, in other words, having a homogeneous lineup for all markets, very few of them have actually succeeded. And so you have this really interesting situation where there's a great variety in the cars available depending on where in the world that you are. Now, for some, they solve this problem by having different brands for different markets. Case in point, General Motors. In the USA, you have Chevrolet, and though they did try that here, it didn't work. Instead, you've got Vauxhall, and then for Europe, that's Opel. For companies like Ford, though they do then have multiple brands in the USA, here it is simply Ford. But the lineup is almost entirely different to that you'd find in the US. Even the likes of Kia have models they simply don't bother selling here because they suspect there is no market for it. And to be honest, they're probably right about that. And then you also have brands that in their own markets are extremely successful, often being big players, but outside of those are almost unknown. And Proton is one of those. For a good while they gave the UK market a fair go, but it didn't work out all that well. 23 years ago, in 2000, there were 155 Proton dealers in the UK, but today there are technically none. A few service centres remain to look after the cars that they did sell here, but in terms of buying a new Proton, well, you haven't been able to do that here for quite a while. And mention the Proton name to just about anybody petrol heady, and there's only one car they'll talk about, the Satria GTI, and that is what I'm driving today. Now, let's not muck about, shall we? There is one reason, and one reason alone, that this car ever got any attention and is still by some remembered today. And that's the small badge on the back that says handling by Lotus. And this is significant to petrol heady types in particular for two reasons. The first being that though you may not have heard of Proton, you probably have heard of Lotus. And secondly, if you've heard of Lotus, you'll know there's one thing that they're famous for, and that is their handling. This car was built during an era where Proton actually owned Lotus. In fact, humorously, a number of years ago when Proton did still technically exist in the UK, I think they sold 4 cars in a year. And I was in the car park at Hethel and saw a brand spanking new Proton, which was a very unusual thing. Then next to it was another. And then I looked a bit further around and I saw that there were indeed 4 brand new, or brand new for that year, Proton cars in the car park at Hethel, meaning that I suspect for the last few years of their life, the one and only customer for brand new Protons in the UK was in fact Lotus, who they owned. So not really spectacular, is it? In any case, this car came a good few years earlier, in production from 1998 to 2005, which is already pretty long. The model on which it was based was introduced in 1994, and it's essentially a Mitsubishi Colt but built by Proton. The GTI, as you might imagine, was the spiciest variant of them all and came in 3-door guise with the aero addenda that you see as standard and a 1.8 litre 16-valve engine, which is also Mitsubishi derived, though if Wikipedia is to be believed, and take anything from that site with a grain of salt, it's in fact from a Lancer, though in its initial application it had a turbo and here it doesn't. The internals have been changed to compensate, to raise the compression ratio, so on and so forth, and that means the car now makes a heady 140 horsepower, which, though by today's standard is laughable, that wouldn't even qualify this as a mild hatch. 20 odd years ago, that was just about okay. A Golf GTI would have been making similar power. Drive was sent to the front wheels via a 5-speed manual gearbox. The car weighs just over 1,100 kilos, and this combination was good enough to produce performance figures of a 130 mile an hour top speed and just under 8 seconds for the 0 to 60 dash. Curiously, though you could use many adjectives to describe this car, cheap was not one of them. Back in 2000, this would have set you back £14,500, which notably is near 500 quid more than the Peugeot 206 GTI, a far more established hot hatch. As a result, they didn't exactly fly off the shelves, with only 150 of them finding a home in the first 6 months of production. And whilst that's already a fairly low number, even more concerning is the fact that allegedly today, just 53 of them remain in Britain, and that really isn't very many. If you're being polite about it, I suppose you'd call it a cult classic, although if you weren't, you could just call it a dismal failure. Today, there is one for sale on Auto Trader at £9,000, but given the fact there aren't any others out there, I couldn't tell you whether that's good or bad money. And having previously never driven one, I couldn't have told you whether it was a good buy or not. Until today, when I was brought this by its kind owner, Christian, who is a lovely young lad that studied car design at university, but in order to bolster his student income, started a business called Heel and Toe Cars, and he has a really cool selection of interesting and unusually specified cars that, if you watch this channel, I think you'd also find fascinating. I'll put the link to his Instagram page, which is essentially where he does his business, in the description down below. In the interest of full disclosure, we actually tried to do this review about 18 months ago, and we got as far as doing the drive-by shots when the car developed a slightly worrying rattle. Fearing something fairly terminal, we opted not to continue, so I never got to sample the car for myself. It went away, waited for a specialist to look at it, who never materialised, then someone else came and looked at it and said, actually, no, it's not anywhere near as bad as you think, but there is an issue with the hydraulic lifters. This being a fairly rare car with a rare version of that engine, getting parts wasn't easy, so it took quite some time for it to get fixed, and now, though it isn't completely finished, it's mechanically good enough for me to at last sample. And I'm very glad to have been given the opportunity, because this is a really, really cool car. I'm not a huge fan of the silver paintwork, which still needs tending to in a few places, but I believe this may have been the only shade available for them. I certainly haven't ever seen one in another colour. The interior is as you would expect for a sort of kinda low rent car from the late 1990s, and to compare it with my own MG ZR, which would have been a rival for this, you've actually got a little bit more space. I think the seating position feels more natural. These Recaro seats are certainly much better than those in the MG, and although the MG's got a bigger boot and maybe a little bit more room in the back, this does feel a lot better screwed together. And that should tell you a lot on account of the fact that this car has 135,000 miles on it, and my MG 27,000. And people wonder why the British car industry failed. But neither this nor the MG built their reputation on their luxuriously appointed interiors. Instead, they became well loved on account of how they drove. So, time to find out whether the Proton Satria GTI deserves that Lotus badge on the back and the love that many feel it should have. Let's go. I have to say, this really isn't what I was expecting, but that's not the same as saying it's a bad car. The first thing you notice is that the suspension is a little softer than you might have thought. Over certain little parts of the road, potholes, manhole covers and the like, it does crash into the ground, but that really isn't all that unusual for a car of this age and type. However, when you start to press on, it really is quite soft, quite delicate in that classic Lotus-y way. It really works with the road. In fact, just going past is an old 7th generation Toyota Celica, and they're actually kind of similar, maybe a little bit softer, again, even than this. The engine then, though it has a very pleasing 7,500 RPM redline here, doesn't actually seem to want to go all the way. It gets to about 7.2, 7.3 happily enough, but then just stops suddenly. The redline clearly is set a little lower than it's been painted on the dials. But it's pleasant enough, doesn't really have any gusto as you might expect from the 140 horsepower headline figure, but that makes it a very enjoyable thing to use. The gearbox has a longer throw than you might expect, but also very little slop, very little play. It's actually a bit better than I thought it was going to be. The turning circle, likewise, thanks to my experience with many MGs and Hondas and other cars of the era, I was just expecting it to be absolutely awful. But it's not. And this makes a great sound too. Real classic twin cam vibes from it. The exhaust isn't standard, the original one I believe rusted through, however it has been remade to essentially close to OEM, we believe. It is the steering really that's the biggest shocker, because it feels like the rack is impossibly slow. Maybe it's the fact that many a modern car, not just the likes of your Ferraris and that, have a very sharp and fast rack, but this feels like you need essentially a quarter of a turn before it, well, does anything. Let me demonstrate. Let me get through a couple of bends here. I mean, this feels so unnatural. I know these roads really, really well, and this amount of steering lock is just not normal. I'll probably show you, look, I can do that. My car's not really doing anything. The feel through the wheel also just isn't Lotus-y. It's not. It really isn't. How's grip? Grip's good. It's a struggle really to get it to brake under power. This bit of road looks a little bit iffy. Want to be careful here. Farmers, eh? I don't believe there is traction control here, or I certainly can't see a button to turn it off anyway. And though it will get up to the national speed limit reasonably briskly, beyond that it doesn't really have all that much interest. If you can hear a buzzing sound, by the way, that's not the car. There are some spare number plates in the back seat. One of the things that I do love about this is the exhaust aside, it is pretty much original. It's a one-owner car from new. It's only gone through a couple of dealers on its way to Christian, and he's been spending a lot of time and money on it over the last, I think, near 2 years, trying to get it into the condition that he would want it. He readily acknowledges that when it does come time to sell this car, he's almost certainly going to make a loss on it. But one of the reasons that I like him quite as much as I do is the fact that he is a petrol head first and car dealer second. He doesn't want to see a car as rare as this go out in a condition that simply isn't good enough. And that I respect, as I'm sure you do too. Though I must admit, at the moment, the one piece of this car that I am really, really quite fond of is the head unit down here. Big, doubled in, for no apparent reason, silver CD player, which in the late 90s, early noughties would have been quite fancy, and I just love it. I want to nick it and put it in the Celica. This steering wheel does feel like it's about 2 sizes too big for the car. I like the little GTI script in the middle, so they have spent a little bit of effort, and this funky textured stuff here is very typical for the period, as is the dotty aluminium looking stuff that's not aluminium at all. I think it's plastic all throughout the dash and the center console. The indicators are on the right hand side, presumably on account of the Colt underpinnings. And, as is common with cars of the period, visibility is excellent. The dash is nice and low, so you've got a great view of the road. A pillar is really thin, and the B pillar, it feels like, is yards behind you, so you've got excellent visibility in just about any conceivable scenario. Straight out the back is good, and as previously mentioned, though rear seat space and boot space isn't excellent, it's certainly good enough. You will get 4 people in this car. Overall, it's not that big, meaning you can use it just about anywhere, and it does feel very much at home on particularly tight, twisty and narrow B roads. Though there was never another GTI, Proton did make a second generation Satria, the Neo, and I have experienced one of those. It's quite a different car. I believe it's a more bespoke thing, being actually designed and built by Proton as opposed to this, a rebadged vehicle, but it really is a bit compromised in terms of the interior and feels very much low rent compared to this. Also, a lot smaller. That thing's impossibly tight inside. The engine selection was also fairly underwhelming, but I would say in terms of handling, that might actually be a little bit better and more engaging than this. The trade-off though is that I do remember it being a fairly harsh car, which given the fairly lowly power output was just a tad disappointing. This though it is a very oddball car and in no one area seems to excel, I think genuinely is a bit of a cult classic. There's something just unbelievably cool about it. It's rare, it's weird, it's unusual, though the steering's a bit slow, the engine a bit lethargic, and getting parts can be difficult. It's a cool thing. And if you can pick one up at sub 10 grand, which you definitely can, I don't know how much this one is going to be going up for when it sells, though it isn't a logical or sensible purchase, we're car people, we've rarely been logical or sensible. And this is a car that I think would do very, very well in a collection of unusual machinery. It was probably unreasonable of me to have ever expected Lotus to have made essentially an Elise hatchback, because the resources they would have had were always very limited. There was only so much they could do to change this, and truth be told, I don't know how much input they actually had. But as a package, it's actually quite charming, this. For some reason, I just like it. But if you were going to ask me to provide a logical reason as to why you should buy one even today over a 206 GTI, an EP3 Civic, or even an MG ZR, I haven't got one. I just don't. But I'm very glad to have driven it. And I want to say a big thank you to Christian for bringing it out and persevering with it and making sure this piece of unusual motoring history has been preserved. And as ever, a big thanks to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.